Hello and welcome to The Professor Speaks. I'm Raphael Chacón, Director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture and Professor of Art History and Criticism at the University of Montana. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to this series of lectures we're doing on the Roman Empire and the early Christian period. And this is a course in which we are, and this is just a reminder of what we're doing here, it is a course in which we look at the broad outlines of Roman history through its architecture, its sculpture, and its minor arts when they're relevant. So without much ado, we're going to enter a new period, and this is actually a very interesting period and a significant period in Roman history. It's known as the Late Empire. So it's a period of great civil war and many rulers contending for the imperial throne. And as a result, of course, interesting characters as well. So, and the visual arts, it's also a rich period, a transitional period for the visual arts in the Roman world. And so we'll discuss that as we enter this, this conversation about the late empire. So without much ado, let me share the screen and bring up our PowerPoint discussion for today. So the period we're studying is called the Late Empire. And if you remember, the Severan dynasty collapsed in 235 with the murder, the assassination of Alexander Severus. The Severan dynasty was a long ruling dynasty, a significant dynasty, and yet it was really the last long, stable period that we have in Roman history before this late empire, which is actually characterized by a great deal of instability. The murder of Alexander Severus led to another civil war. And then from about 235 to 284, we have a long period of instability in Roman history. This is almost half a century in which there were 25 different emperors, a number of them generals vying for control of both the army, the navy, and the Senate, and most of them failing, as a matter of fact. All but two of these 25 individuals who ruled as emperor were slain in battle or murdered. So it is indeed a long period of instability. And some argue that the dissolution of the Roman Empire ultimately goes back to this particular period, this late period, late empire. There was very little actual construction in Rome, although a couple of the monuments that we do have from that period are very impressive. And we'll talk about one of those in particular. But it's also a great age for bust portraiture and certainly for coinage. And of course, it makes sense if you think about all these individuals contending for the throne and using the visual arts as a way of establishing authority, legitimacy, and propagandizing their particular attributes or skills or their claims to the throne. So, so let's go ahead and begin talking about a period, this 49-year period of soldier emperors. So this is the first one we're going to look at, and his name is Maximus Thrax. And by the way, I'm just going to show you portraits of these in sequence because no one of these individuals is any more important than the next. So this is the likeness here, both in a coin and a bust portrait of Maximus Thrax. And of course, he's the man responsible in large part for bringing down the Severan dynasty. I think of Maximus Thrax as the emperor with the underbite. He has this prominent underbite, which we see in his both in coinage and the bust portraits. Sometimes it's toned down by the artist. You can tell they're trying not to magnify that, that particular feature, yet it's there, Maximus Thrax. This is Balbinus, also known as Pupienus. And this is his portrait there on the right, a kind of thick individual. Actually, these are two individuals who ruled, let me back up here, two individuals who ruled concurrently in the year 238 with the portraits left and right. And then you see that wonderful coin there that shows two hands bound together, clasping in a kind of symbol of amity. This is Gordian the First. And this is Gordian III in two different bust portraits. And then this marvelous sculpture is an image of Philip the Arab, clearly somebody who came from the African provinces of the Roman Empire. So Philip the Arab, who ruled between 244 and 249. This is Trajan Decius, Trajan the Tenth, from 248 to 51. Again, most of these rulers in this period had very short rules. Many of them were lucky to have a year on the imperial throne. Now, this man, Aurelion, was significant in a number of different ways. Aurelion was a general, and the denarius that you see there in the lower left actually commemorates the fact that he toppled an empire, a rival empire to the Romans, and this is known as the Palmyrene Empire. It was based in the city of Palmyra in Syria. And this was actually a Middle Eastern civilization that arose, but it was quite Romanized in many, many ways. At one point subject to the Roman Empire, then it gained its independence, and it was then reunified into the empire by Aurelion, who was a successful general who ruled for 5 years between 270 and 275 in the Common Era. So there's a portrait of Aurelion there on the right. And here's a map that shows us how the empire was divided at that point between the Roman Empire, of course, is at the core of the Mediterranean basin, with this Palmyrene Empire to the east, which absorbed Egypt, the entire Palestine region, and then far up into Syria and into what is now modern-day Turkey. This is the empire that Aurelian will bring back, will reunify with the empire, and therefore gains a certain degree of legitimacy with the Roman state and the Roman citizens. In the act of reconquering Palmyra, he defeated the woman that you see in this romantic image from the 19th century. This is Herbert Schmalz's portrait of Zenobia. And Zenobia was the queen of Palmyra. And there are coins to that effect. For example, there you see one on the lower right, both its verso and recto, front and back of the coin, showing us this Palmyrene queen, a celebrated figure in her day, and also continued to be an important rival to the Romans, a kind of a romantic figure in Western civilization in later times, particularly in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. This is a marvelous marble sculpture carved by the American sculptor Harriet Hosmer of Zenobia in chains. This lives today in St. Louis in the United States, in the central United States, southern United States. And it was carved in 1859 by a devotee of all things Roman, the American sculptor Harriet Hosmer, who lived and worked in Rome in the 19th century. Zenobia is always shown as a dignified, matronly figure, very much in a Roman style with some exotic touches, given that she was indeed from ancient Syria. And these are some images that show us what ancient Palmyra looked like. It was a magnificent capital city for this empire, this rival empire to the Romans. This is, for example, the remnants that you see up there of the monumental arch. And on the lower right, you have a reconstruction of that arch. Again, it's not just simply a doorway or a gateway through which individuals could pass, but it was actually a structure. It was actually a very large building with this magnificent tripartite archway. And there you see its ruins on the left. Again, Palmyra in Syria, ancient Syria, was a formidable capital and a formidable rival to the Romans at one point, until Aurelian will bring it back into the Roman fold. Now, not too long ago, this city was devastated by ISIS, that is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which took over this region of Iraq in the modern state of Syria. This is a photograph. The individual that you see here is holding a photograph of that before 2015, and the photo that you see behind it is what that temple looked like in 2017 after ISIS bombed it. So a great deal of destruction took place in this archaeological site in ancient Palmyra under the hands of the Islamic State. And there is, in fact, the evidence of it that you see there. This Palmyra was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, much destroyed by ISIS and the Islamic extremists. This is the Temple of Bel Shamin. And what it points to is the fact that even though Palmyra was a Romanized culture, it had its own local culture, its own local deities, its own ancient gods that were worshipped there, including the god Bel, and worshipped at this temple. And this was the temple not too long ago. And here are some images of what the Islamic State did to that magnificent survival from the antiquity. Probably the largest tragedy of the occupation of this part of Syria by the Islamic State is the assassination of this man. This is Khaled alAssaad, who was a Syrian archaeologist, a famed Syrian archaeologist. And he was head of the antiquities at the UNESCO site of Palmyra. He worked at that site for over 40 years. And in some ways, we must pay homage to that work and to this man, this significant contributor to human history. His life came tragically to an end when he was beheaded by the Islamic State on August 18th of 2015. So, Khaled alAssaad. Now, Aurelius was an important emperor, even though he ruled for only a short 5 years. During his reign, an enormous project took part in Rome. In some ways, it tells us a little bit about the instability of the empire in this period, and also the instability of the Roman capital. Aurelian built the walls, the massive walls that still surround much of the city today, the capital of modern-day Italy. And that's the outline that you see there in brown. These are the famous Aurelian walls, which took in, of course, the 7 hills of Rome to the right of the Tiber River, and then also much of the land below the Janiculum Hill to the west. And that's the area that you see across the river. It's the region that today is known in Rome as Trastevere, or across the Tevere or Tiber River. And that area came under the protection of these new walls built by the Emperor Aurelian. So we've seen this diagram before in earlier lectures, but now you see how important that series of walls is to the Roman city. And of course, the rebuilding of the walls tells us something about the conditions in which the state found itself in the 4th century. What we have here is, in fact, a great deal of instability, the threat of invasion, and the threat of potential warfare with Rome's neighbors. So Aurelius had these walls constructed. In some cases, older walls were rebuilt, reshored up. And then many of the gates that are still there today, leading to these great avenues or roads away from the capital city, many of those gates are, of course, date to the reconstruction or the construction of the Aurelian walls. And here you see the gates, all named surrounding the circumference of the Roman capital. And here's some images of what those walls look like today. They are massive. And it's actually quite a wonderful trip if you ever have time in the capital city in Rome to actually walk these walls. You can actually walk around the walls, both in and out in many stretches. And you can walk in the walls or on top of the walls in a couple of stretches, particularly on the south side of the city. And of course, the gates are fabulous, and many of them are still there. This is the Porta Asinaria, and this was built again in the third century, between 270 and 275. Here's this one wonderful model. I believe this is in Germany, showing us the way these walls were constructed. So, the gates were constructed. And again, this is a structure. It is almost a building, if you will, sometimes with rooms, compartments, allowing the soldiers and the guards who lived here and protected the walls to take shelter. So we have obviously the gateway down at ground level, and then second, third levels, allowing individuals to live and inhabit the guards, the towers, and the structure, the building of the gatehouse itself. I mentioned that in this period of the soldier emperors, the late empire, there were a number of famous and important individuals as well. And among them is Diocletian. And Diocletian probably has the worst reputation of all the Roman emperors, although he had many rivals for that role. But Diocletian was one of the warrior emperors, a significant player in this late imperial period, and an individual that I think many historians in some ways fault with the ultimate dissolution of the Roman Empire. And I'll explain how that is a little bit later. Gaius Aurelius Valerianus Diocletianus, Diocletian as he is known in the Western world. He was born in Dioclea in Dalmatia, that is across the Adriatic Sea from Italy in the area of the Balkans, the lower Balkans. Dioclea is in what we call today Croatia. It's in the modern nation state of Croatia, the Roman Dalmatia. In 284, he becomes emperor upon the death of Numerianus, one of these general rulers. And he ruled in 292 as a co-emperor with Maximian of Gaul. So here we have, again, foreigners or foreign-born emperors born in the provinces, Maximian in Gaul, he born in Dalmatia across the Adriatic. And these co-rulers then in 293, mostly at the instigation of Diocletian, created what is known as the Tetrarchy. Now, the Tetrarchy was the empire divided into four. And so they divided the empire to create a certain peace across the empire. They divided the empire into four parts. And 10 years later, they would celebrate, or Diocletian would celebrate its decennalia, that is, its 10th anniversary. In other words, this four-partite empire was relatively successful. That is, you had four individuals, four generals who came to a kind of confederation, if you will, ruled their various regions, taxed their various regions, amassed their own wealth, maintained their own armies in those regions. So the model that Diocletian and his cohorts came up with seemed to be stable. Eventually, it will spell problems for the Roman Empire as one grand entity, obviously, but at least for this in this early period, it seemed to be stable enough. Now, Diocletian, one of the reasons why he is considered one of the bad emperors is because he persecuted a number of individuals within the Roman community, including its early Christian community. If you remember, Christ was put to death by the Roman state sometime in the 1st century AD, in the 1st century in the Common Era. And then by the 4th century, this community was becoming more and more of a gadfly and a sore spot for the Roman state. And so during the reign of Diocletian, there were a number of persecutions on the Christian community in Rome and various parts of the empire. And so Diocletian has a bad rap, particularly from early Christian authors who saw him as an arch enemy of the Christian community. Diocletian was also notable for a number of different reasons. In 305, he's the first Roman emperor on record to actually abdicate, that is, to give up power freely. And upon his abdication, he retired. So this was a new model. Remember, most of these men go down in flames or go down kicking and screaming or go down through assassination. Diocletian actually abdicated. He built an enormous palace compound in the city of Spalatum, known in Italian as Spalato, or Split today in Croatia. It is a marvelous city today on the coast in coastal Croatia, and that city grew around the ancient palace built by Diocletian, this notorious Roman emperor in the late period. But Diocletian didn't ignore Rome, the city that he ruled, and in fact, one of his greatest contributions is a bathhouse. And so up there in the northern part of the city, you see, in fact, a dark structure known as the Baths of Diocletian. And in our previous lecture, we talked about the Baths of Caracalla, and I showed you those magnificent ruins and some reconstructions of the ruins of Baths of Caracalla. They don't hold a candle to the Baths of Diocletian. In size, the Baths of Diocletian were larger, and in terms of the amount of the portions of the building that have survived, there's even a greater amount in the Baths of Diocletian. So let's take a look at that structure. And again, here's the map of the capital, the Roman capital, with the baths there highlighted in red in the upper right-hand part of the diagram. And an image of some of those ruins today, as magnificent as any of the ones that you see down at the Baths of Caracalla. And here's an image by Etienne Duperrak, and I want to apologize. In our previous lecture, I misspelled this French Renaissance artist's name, not only misspelled it, but mispronounced it as well. But this is Etienne Duperrak, and this is his engraving of the Baths of Diocletian. So this image comes to us from the middle of the 16th century. And as you can see, this building is virtually intact. Even portions of the vaults are there. Of course, it had been ransacked and looted, and the grounds of the building, of the structure, the entire bath complex were gone. But yet, this large part of it actually survived. Ironically, this large part that you see here was but a very small part of the original Baths of Diocletian. This is, in fact, the building that you see there in Etienne Duperrak's engraving is the structure that you see on the lower right in this aerial photograph. And by the way, this shows us Rome with the train station, the Termini train station there in the upper left, that huge modern complex. And the buildings that you see in the foreground were all parts at one time, or actually they're resting atop the ruins of the ancient Baths of Diocletian, which was, what you're seeing here is about an eighth, actually the building on the lower right, it's about an eighth of the original Baths of Diocletian. So this was a mammoth complex, and there you see it's in diagram, the thermae, or the baths that were begun in the late 3rd century and into the 4th century, built by Diocletian the emperor. In the center, what you have is in fact a structure, a building that was in fact a series of courtyards, of course pools, cold, tepid, warm in the traditional pattern, gymnasia, arcades, again libraries, all kinds of amenities for the Roman citizens, and then surrounded by an enormous walled garden. And what you see on the periphery of this diagram are the walls of that bath complex with exedra, these semicircular spaces. There were fountains, sculptures, all kinds of incredible amenities for the citizenry in the Baths of Diocletian. And there you see a marvelous model of the pools, the basins, the buildings that composed, and the gardens that composed the bath complex. So it was a large, mammoth composition of services that this bath complex provided. And a small portion of it, about an eighth of it, is retained today, some 2,000 years later, which is quite remarkable to me. Of course, much reconstructed, but in structure, that is, the footprint is still there. And as you saw in that print from the 16th century, a good portion of the building was actually there. So much so that in the 16th century, it was rebuilt and actually built into as a Christian church. So the Baths of Diocletian, at least the part that was retained, became the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli e Martiri, that is Saint Mary of the Angels and Martyrs, and you can visit that church today. The other reason for visiting this is not only because it formed a part of the baths, and you can actually see there right in front of you some of the walls of the ruins of the baths, but this building was in fact reconstructed by none other than Michelangelo Buonarroti, one of the most important artists, Michelangelo, one of the most important artists of the Italian Renaissance. There is his portal there on the left, the entrance, the new entrance, if you will, to the Church of St. Mary of the Angels and Martyrs. And this is what that building looks like today in the interior. It is fabulous, and it evokes in some ways the scale, the proportions of the ancient baths. Everything that you see, from the marble flooring, the marble columns, the walls that you see here, is modern, meaning that this was built in the 16th century and added, if you will, to the ancient ruins that you saw in that earlier print by Michelangelo Buonarroti. The paintings are not by him, but they're by other artists. The sculptures are by other artists. There are no Michelangelo works of art here, except for this reconstruction that you see. So Michelangelo worked with the building that was given to him that he inherited from the ancient Romans, rebuilt it, and there you see the ancient vaults of that marvelous bath of Diocletian. By the way, that building also has a wonderful sun feature in it. There is a little opening in the roof that allows the sun to penetrate, and as the sun travels across the sky, a shaft of light comes into the building, casting a shadow across the floor, and that floor is marked as a kind of calendar. So you should check that out when you visit the Church of St. Mary and the Angels and Martyrs in Rome today. So I mentioned that Diocletian retired to Spalato, or Spalatum in Latin, this wonderful place on the Adriatic coast, facing Italy, if you will, to the west. The modern city of Split today grew up around the palace of, here's the harbor of Split in Croatia today. It grew up around the palace of Diocletian. And here is a marvelous French drawing of that, the palace there in the lower left. That's the rectangle that you see there facing the sea. And then, as you can see, the modern city growing up around it, facing the harbor at Spalato, or Split as it is known in Croatian today. There's another beautiful, this is a tourist image, obviously, of that city. The palace is the structure that you see there in the center of the image, behind those plantings of palm trees. The tower that you see there is a medieval tower at the Cathedral of Split today. That tower was added to the Mausoleum of Diocletian. So imagine a rectangle starting with those columns and then going back into inland from the sea. That was the palace of Diocletian, the place where he retired. And here is a beautiful reconstruction. This is, I believe, a National Geographic reconstruction of that palace as it looked in antiquity between the years 298 to 306, when it was built and inhabited by the Emperor Diocletian. And by the way, the journey across the Adriatic to Italy from here was long, but not terribly arduous. So imagine the city being opposite the Adriatic on the Dalmatian coast. So it was actually a trip, a couple of days away from the Roman capital. So Diocletian had to travel by sea across the Adriatic to the west, and then probably disembarking at Ravenna, and then traveling by land across the Italian peninsula over the Apennine Mountains to reach Rome on the western side of the Italian peninsula. So it was a long trip. It was close enough, but also far enough away from Rome for him to take shelter and avoid the Roman situation. And of course, this is his homeland, so this is where he retired to. And he built himself a fabulous palace compound, much of which is intact today, or at least in the urban plan of it is there today in modern Split. It was a guarded, heavily fortified compound, as you can see here, with a sea battery facing the ocean, a cryptoporticus, that is a gallery high up above the sea, giving visibility from the palace itself to the ocean, then a compound that included temples and mausolea, and then gardens, and then of course lots and lots of chambers for the army that was stationed here, that protected the guard, that protected him, and the thousands of servants who attended to every need of Diocletian. So again, these are French diagrams from the early 20th century that show us on the left the plan of the Palace of Diocletian, this large rectangle. The palace itself is, as you can see, to the west, facing the harbor. That is, of course, where the apartments, the living and dining rooms and bedrooms, the kitchens of the palace were located. Then immediately to the east, you have the mausoleum. That's that octagonal structure that you see there in the lower left. And then below that is a temple. And then this enormous crossing of an axis, a kind of large open space. Below that, gardens farther to the east. all of this surrounded by a wall with gates and towers. Three major gates going north-south and then to the east, and of course, many, many guard towers. On the right, you see that a map of that in the early 20th century. So as you can see, much of the city is still there, much of the palace is still there, only it was filled in the Middle Ages. It became part of an urban fabric, a medieval fabric of the city as it evolved into the 20th century, into modern times. But the structures are still, the pattern, the relative pattern has been filled in, but it's still visible there in large part today. Here is the cryptoporticus, that is the seawall of the palace. And imagine that the palace was actually just immediately behind this, facing the sea from the gallery, that arcade or loggia, to use the Italian word, that behind that loggia were the apartments, the personal apartments of Diocletian and his court. And this diagram comes from the English artist Robert Adam, from the 18th century. So this is what this place looked like in 1764. So much of the palace had survived into modern times. These are views of Split today. It's a beautiful sea walk just below Diocletian's cryptoporticus. Much of that cryptoporticus has been filled in, as you can see, with stores and boutiques and Prada shops and all kinds of apartments as well. So it is part of the urban fabric of modern day Split today. At one time, it was the home of one man and his court. The gates are still visible today. This is the Porta Aurea, or the Golden Gate, and this is a photograph from about 1912 there on your left, and a reconstruction, again, a French reconstruction of that gate as it might have looked like in the time of Diocletian. This is the Portaferria, or the Iron Gate, its remnants there with some medieval additions to it. And again, these are twin towers with a gate in the middle. So we have a kind of structure, a building, if you will, and then the walls of the palace then left and right of those twin towers. The gate is open today. You can walk through it today as you enter the city. Again, there are three major gates to this palace compound. And again, here's the diagram showing us the palace. On the left side, you have the imperial apartments facing the sea or the harbor. And then in the quadrant, this half of the palace compound was finished by the mausoleum, the octagonal building that you see there in the foreground, and a small temple in its own courtyard opposite to finish this half. And then you have the crossing, if you will, there at the lower right-hand corner of this model. And here you see the view to that ancient temple. It is now, of course, filled in with many, many, many buildings and constructions of the Middle Ages into modern times. But the original entrance to the temple temple facade, is still there, and you can visit that as a tourist today, as you see in the photograph in front of you. Here's some more views of the arcades that surrounded that temple in this quadrant of the palace of Diocletian. And now I want to show you the remnants of the mausoleum of Diocletian, where he was interred. There you see it again in these diagrams, in both the modern image on the right and the ancient image on the left, or the reconstruction of the ancient palace on the left. It was a formidable building. And this is a diagram, again, a French drawing of it from the early 20th century, showing us what that mausoleum looked like in ancient times. This is where the body of Diocletian was laid to rest, and his family members were laid to rest. There were images of him here, again, as a deified emperor. This is the building that then becomes the Cathedral of Split in Christian times. And at that point, they added the bell tower that you see here. So the bell tower is not a Roman construction. It is a medieval bell tower added to the mausoleum. And there are the original walls of the mausoleum that you see there, with a gallery that surrounded, a gallery of columns, if you will, that surrounded the building. And some of those columns are still visible today. You can actually visit the cathedral, obviously, and remember that you are then inside a late imperial Roman building. So I mentioned that Diocletian had a number of important claims to fame. And of course, the creation of the Tetrarchy is one of them. So I want to talk about the Tetrarchy here. In 293, the Tetrarchy was created by Diocletian and 3 other individuals. And so let me name them, and we'll start talking about how that process took place. So Diocletian, Galerius, Maximian, and Constantius Chlorus were the 4 tetrarchs, that is the 4 individuals who ruled a divided empire, a quartered empire. And this empire lasted until the death of Diocletian, till the abdication of Diocletian in the year 305, when he was replaced by the Emperor Constantine. And we'll talk about Constantine in our next lecture, a very important individual in his own right. But first, let's discuss the Tetrarchy. So the idea was to divide the empire into 4 parts. The westernmost part was known as Augusta Treverorum, and it was based in modern Trier, Germany. This became the capital of the Gallic Empire, or Gallia, as it was known. So we call it Gaul today, basically France and Germany and some of the lowlands. This was ruled by Constantius Chlorus, who was known as the Western Caesar, and the prefecture becomes this quarter is known as the prefecture of Gallia, or Gaul. The next one is Italy and Africa, or Italia et Africa, or Mediolanum. It was actually ruled from modern-day Milan, that is below the Italian Alps, and this was ruled by Maximian. So he was known as the Western Augustus, Italia et Africa. So Italy and Africa become one prefecture. The third one is known as Illyria. So these are the Balkans and the Danube. So below the Danube all the way to the Balkans, and it includes Greece. This is Illyria. And it was ruled out of the ancient Sirmium, that is Sremska Mitrovica, which is near Belgrade today. So this is a part of Serbia today. And this was ruled by Galerius. And then finally, the province of Oriens was the one that Diocletian kept for himself. So this is ruled from northwestern Turkey, the city of Nicomedia, now modern Izmit. And this was where Diocletian ruled as Augustus. And this was the province of Oriens, or the easternmost province. And now a map of these provinces. So there you see in yellow Gallia, or Gaul. So it included, of course, Britain and much of France, Germany, and some of the lowlands. And then, so that's Gaul. And then Italia et Africa includes Spain, Africa, and Italy, ruled from Mediolanum, or modern-day Milan. Notice that it's not ruled from Rome, and that's, of course, decisive here. The capital of this prefecture is in Milan in the north, not in Rome. So Rome is becoming somewhat of a backwater in the period of the Tetrarchy. Then in pink, you have the Illyria, and that is, of course, ruled from Dalmatia, and that is from Nicomedia, and that, from Dalmatia, and that is, of course, the area ruled by Galerius. And it includes Greece and to the far south, and the Balkans up to the Danube in the north. And then the easternmost province of Oriens, ruled by Diocletian himself, includes Egypt and Mesopotamia, the portions of Mesopotamia that are left, and Asia Minor, or what is now mostly Turkey today. So this was the empire under the Tetrarchy, a quartered empire. There is in Venice today, attached to the church of San Marco, the Cathedral of St. Mark in Venice, a marvelous little sculpture. And you can see it there in the lower left hand image. And that is the sculpture there in the corner. And that is one of the few images that we have of the Tetrarchy. That is the 4 men who ruled the Tetrarchy. I love this image because when Venice suffers from flooding, and when they have what the Italians call acqua alta, that is the water rises, what you see are these four tetrarchs, and they look like they're cowering from the rising waters. So it's a marvelous little sculpture. It's made of porphyry, which is this beautiful red, highly polishable, durable stone. And it shows us four individuals in two panels that come side by side to form a corner. And these are the tetrarchs, seemingly bonded in friendship and fellowship, certainly bonded in a kind of truce, a stable power sharing agreement. So we see the four tetrarchs. It's hard to tell who they are. The portraits aren't very good. And this is also indicative of this late imperial style. You can see that anatomy, physiognomy is really not a great priority for these artists. They're simply following convention and not doing it very well, I might add. Artists in this period are simply copying earlier images, piecing images together rather than studying from the body, from nature itself. So what we have is, in fact, a devolution of Roman naturalism in the period of the late empire. And this is a good image, a good representation of that devolution of Roman style, physical style. So again, the image of the tetrarchs, and it's these sculptures are virtually intact, except for, you'll notice that the tetrarch on the far right is missing its foot. And that foot is actually located in Constantinople, the ancient Constantinople, or modern day Istanbul. If you visit the National Archaeological Museum, you can actually see a bit of the foot and the pedestal, and there you see the replacement in the lower right and the original in the lower left in the National Archaeological Museum in Istanbul today. Now, some of these emperors actually built some impressive things. For example, this is the Arch of Galerius in Greece, in Thessaloniki. It was a very, very impressive arch. Again, symbolizing the power of Galerius, this general emperor in this prefecture, this third part of the Roman Empire. And these are some of the sculptures that extol the virtues of Galerius as a military man. Again, what we notice here is this late imperial style, sort of a horror vacui, filling every stretch of the composition with figures that I would argue are not very well done. They are figures that have lost in a certain degree of proportion, a certain degree of detail, and yet it's still an impressive monument. This is the Mausoleum of Galerius, also in Thessaloniki, and you can see it interrupts that great boulevard. There's the modern city that has grown up around his mausoleum, where he was interred. And then beyond the mausoleum is, in fact, the archway that leads to the sea. Here's a view of the mausoleum of Galerius. This building became a Christian church at one point and also a mosque at one point during the Islamic occupation of Greece. This is Maximian, known as the Augustus of the West, who ruled there between 293 and 308. And there is a coin showing us a portrait of Maximian. And here's a coin showing us a portrait of Constantius Chlorus, who ruled as the Caesar of the West. A very interesting likeness of him in the bust portrait on the right. He was responsible for building this marvelous building known as the Aula Palatina in Trier, the capital of that prefecture in Germany. So this is Treverorum, now known today as Trier, and it is a beautiful late Roman building. It is a church today, as you can see, fairly stripped down. It's missing its reveted marble panels, but it is indeed a beautiful Roman basilica with an apse. And imagine that at the end of that apse was once the effigy or the statue of the ruler, the emperor who ruled this quarter of the empire. So this is the Aula Palatina today in Trier, Germany. So the Tetrarchy didn't last, of course. It dissolved. In 305, Diocletian and Maximian abdicated, and I mentioned that Diocletian is the first emperor to abdicate. And they were replaced by Constantius Chlorus, the man I just showed you, and Galerius as the new Augusti. And then in 306, Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, would replace them. So the two sons, Constantine and Maxentius, who was Galerius's son, become the new Caesars, and they form the Second Tetrarchy. This was an unstable institution. Unlike their father's institution, the Second Tetrarchy collapses into civil war. And this is where this late empire in some ways ends. And it ends with Constantine emerging victorious in that civil war in 324. Constantine will reconstitute a unified empire, will dissolve the Tetrarchy once and for all, and will become then a formidable emperor in his own right. And on that note, we'll end today's discussion. We'll pick this up again with the Emperor Constantine and his rule in the late imperial period. Thanks again for joining us on this long series, this slog through Roman history. I appreciate your attending and enjoying these lectures. And again, as always, like us on YouTube so that we can continue to do this. So thank you very much. Take good care, and we'll see you the next time when we talk about Constantine, that all-important emperor.